Really want to thank Chris and Wes for joining us. I see mi senador Gustavo Rivera, thank you. I really am in love with elected officials right now because I'm so worried about our democracy and grateful that people have the courage to run. I'm more grateful than usual to the governor, who yesterday announced that he's restoring the right to vote to people on parole. And I am moved and touched and inspired by the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus, which yesterday issued a statement standing up to support the determination of the New York State Board of Parole to release Herman Bell after more than 40 years. Writing these remarks took me weeks because every day something in the news made me rip it up and start again. You might think I could write Osborne's story without being sidelined by the breaking news that poor Chris has to be disrupted by every day. But as he points out, there is breaking news in our world too. Immigration, detention, mass shootings, police shootings, Me Too, the white-collar circle jerk crime spree you described. They all end up in the criminal justice space. And they address our most urgent concerns: race, equality, citizenship, exclusion from citizenship, the autonomy of women, policing, violence, justice. We've been at this a long time. In the early 20th century, our founder, Thomas Bott Osborne, gave up his business interests for a stint as a volunteer prisoner at Auburn Correctional Facility, and another as an unappreciated warden of Sing Sing. We have two other people here who are unappreciated wardens of Sing Sing at various times in their lives. But he made his name as a pioneer and prophet of prison reform. His protege and my predecessor, Austin McCormick, was known as the father of correctional education, and he was the city's corrections commissioner a year after Rikers Island was opened in 1932. When I first heard the call to close Rikers, a place I've been visiting for 40 years, my first thought was, no, open Rikers. As much as those walls keep the inhabitants in, they keep the public out. They function to conceal the humanity of the people that we serve, the people who live in, visit, and work in those places. If you haven't ever been inside any of such places, at some of the tables you'll notice there's some compasses that we gave you. Follow it in any direction. It's water resistant. You could run smack into a jail or prison wherever you go. The country has more prisons than Walmarts. We have more people in prison than in the US Army. We have more correction officers than Marines. In response to the American playbook of extreme policing, extreme sentencing, and extreme incarceration, we say people can change. People have the right, the responsibility, and the capability of transforming themselves, their relationships, and our communities. And they do every day. Please remember, the punishment paradigm existed long before we had a president who encouraged police to rough up suspects or endorsed the death penalty for drug dealers or blamed Puerto Rico for the weather. And whatever Charlottesville was, it's a long story, one that Chris tells brilliantly in his book. Our country was founded by white colonists who fought for freedom and the right to own other human beings. Listen, it's not getting worse, it's getting uncovered. My main task today is to describe Osborne's work. It's a miserable job, the video helped, but it's an unholy mess. We designed it like that. Because people come to us with not one need, but a cornucopia, right? They need housing and health care and mental health treatment and family support and a job. And the thing I'm working on now, which is aging. Really, we meet people at every age and stage, from children whose parents are arrested to the elders who are now filling our prisons. From arrest to arraignment to sentencing, from jail to prison to parole to resettlement. I wish I didn't have to say it, but cradle to grave. In the last decade since making that video, we've nearly doubled in size and locations. We've added a policy center and 5 new programs, and received a gift from the state of a closed prison to redevelop as a community reentry center. Thank you, Senator Rivera. We now serve more than 12,000 people a year, working in the Bronx, Brooklyn, just opened 2 new offices in Harlem, Newburgh, 27 state prisons, 8 jails, and we're soon in my old stomping grounds in Buffalo. You should clap for Buffalo, really, they need it. And if you haven't been there lately, it's really amazing. Seriously. In our spare time, we're working to ensure that Rikers is first safer and then closed, and that the jails built in the boroughs to replace it hold fewer people for a shorter time in a much more humane way. We don't only grow, we morph as the world evolves. Take El Rio, our drug treatment program. It was designed for the 1980s crack epidemic. It was actually the first outpatient alternative to incarceration program for crack. But now that more people are dying of opioid overdoses in the Bronx than any other borough, we've evolved, and we now offer medically assisted treatment, such as buprenorphine, and we teach our participants to reverse overdoses with naloxone or Narcan. There's a method to this. When Osborne encounters, say, 5 people with the same new problem, we have to ask, is it them, the people, or is it us, the system? Do we need a new program or a new law? Usually both. That's why we established our Center on Justice Across Generations. It's a team that ties policy and practice together. So while we and the State Corrections Department pioneered a free therapeutic video visiting program that enables a kid in a cozy room at Osborne to visit a mom incarcerated 10 hours away, our policy team has to advocate for laws that actually protect a child's right to an in-person visit and ensure that she's considered when deciding in New York State where to incarcerate her mom. And while our program staff and volunteers meet an older person at the prison gate, introduce him to the baffling phenomenon of modern seatbelts, and drive him to his first meal with metal flatware in 30 years, our policy team advocates for sentencing and parole reforms that would mean fewer harmless people growing old and dying in prison. It's been a steep climb, despite their vanishingly low recidivism rates, despite all the evidence that these older prisoners have come to terms with their actions, have spent decades as models of good behavior, and are indeed different people from who they were 2 generations ago when they committed a violent crime. Even with reforms, parole commissioners who follow new guidelines and courageously vote against endless punishment, with the support of our parole board chair who's here today and the 2 members who made that decision, bless you, but they earned a target on their backs from the Police Benevolent Association. And then we have to get loud. Even though we mostly play an inside game, sometimes you have to use your outside voice. We also pair policy with practice because reforms don't implement themselves. Recently, we had a video visit happening in our Brooklyn office between 2 children and their mom in that prison up by Canada. And we learned she was very ill. She had stage 4 lung cancer and she's receiving chemo, but she wasn't expected to survive more than a couple of months. Now, because of many advocates' hard work, New York's medical parole law does now allow some people with terminal illness to be released without waiting for a hearing. But somehow an application hadn't been filed. Our staff leaped into action. I emailed the commissioner with the subject line he's seen before that says, "Help again." He replied, and I paraphrase, of course, "Hold your horses, cowgirl, it ain't that simple." While medically eligible, the mother had an ICE detainer, and if released on medical parole, would be transferred to an immigration detention center and may be deported. So our staff, who never take hold your horses for an answer, tracked down her defense lawyer, who persuaded ICE not to execute the warrant if docs would give them proof of her medical condition, which they did based on our gentle request. The parole chair sent Her approval, thank you, Tina Stanford, which still needed action from the sentencing judge and the DA, who we tracked down for a record time response. We reached out to our friends, Dr. Rachel Bedard and Housing Plus Solutions, for help with post-release treatment and housing, and docs moved her to Bedford so she could be closer to home in the meantime. She's now home with her sons. The new law was crucial, and you could say the system worked, but you could also say we and our partners in 7 different agencies had to work the system hard. Policy reform is like that Uber self-driving car. You may recall recently it killed somebody. Turns out, when a self-driving car goes near a construction site or a big rig, it doesn't do so well. That's why Osborne's human intervention is so important, because reforms don't drive themselves. Like those vehicles, they need alignment and somebody paying attention at the wheel. In all this complexity, it's important to remember this fact. Most people Osborne serves have caused harm to others. We give hard thought to the question about what victims need and what they deserve. We know they need more than prison terms for the people who harm them. Consider the Parkland shooting survivors. Those families have not spent 1 minute talking about the shooter or the punishment he deserves. Their focus is to keep people safe. They want accountability, and they look for it in larger systems. In our long experience, a victim's healing does not come from exacting personal retribution. The children of Parkland are wise to look for it elsewhere. Osborne's role is to challenge our people to hold themselves accountable and to provide the evidence that people can change. Responsibility, unfortunately, is not something you can impose on someone else. It's a grace you give yourself. It's a context, and we do this work knowing that the people that we serve have experienced trauma, loss, violence, racism, and many generations of systemic poverty. They act in a context where officers encountering a young father picking up a cell phone can see a thug lunging for a gun, where police can shoot dead a mentally ill person who was well known and well loved in his neighborhood, and nobody's surprised. They act in the context of unlimited campaign contributions from bail bond companies, private prison companies, and predatory phone companies that are bent on killing any reform that would send fewer people to prison for less time. So that's our accountability for inequality, because that's also violence. So the teens from Parkland believe the system is broken, and they can fix it. But the young folks at Black Lives Matter know the system is working exactly as designed. That's why our mission isn't to fix it, but to shift it from punishment to reconciliation, from retribution to redemption. Thank goodness the young are at the gates. You've heard of the school-to-prison pipeline. I took the law school-to-prison pipeline. There was a lot of that going around in 1971 after Attica. The first time I spoke at one of these breakfasts, though, I talked about the impact on my own children of their father's incarceration, a sentence we thought would last 11 years, but which after 9 parole denials lasted 25. When he was finally released in 2009 in his late 60s, I spoke in this room about the amazing experience of welcoming him home, but they kept him too long. Within a year of getting their dad home, my kids knew there was no making up for lost time. Last year here, I spoke of his memory slipping, of my children visiting him in a nursing home, just like they had for prison for 25 years. Last fall, my daughter brought him home. For weeks, she gave him these small sips of water and Al Green tunes, which she thinks are nourishing, and for him they were. And in the middle of the night, she poured through boxes of letters that her father had sent her from the time she was 6 until she was past 30, the letters she'd kept. This past Thanksgiving, my daughter and I held her dad as he took his last breath. But what she said was, "I'm so lucky. I got more of my father in our calls and visits than most kids ever do. And I have something nobody else I know has. My daddy wrote down all the lessons I will ever need. He told me the story of my past, mapped a pathway I can follow. My father of blessed memory died a free warrior, and he made me a free black woman. What a blessing. And we are blessed to have you, to have our partners, because without you, this work would be impossible, improbable, and honestly not very much fun. Our board, our staff, who I wish I could acknowledge every one of your programs and all the amazing work that you do. Our donors and colleagues who take collective responsibility for transforming the justice system. The journalists who report the real news, my idol, Katrina vanden Heuvel and The Nation. The Marshall Project, The New Yorker, the editorial board of the New York Times, and Chris, who keeps me company at 8 o'clock. Unfortunately, sweetie, I have to mute it. I can't take it. But I love seeing your face. We're grateful to the colleges that welcome our program's graduates and prepare them to come back to join our staff. Our volunteers, especially the brave souls from St. James Church and the David Goldberg Fan Club, who board JetBlue airplanes carrying all those children to see their moms upstate. But here's the real reason we gave you a compass. Because light pollution obscures the North Star. And we know you can be a true bystander, somebody who stands by people and guides them to freedom. You know, a year before Martin Luther King was assassinated 50 years ago this month, he went to Riverside Church. It's northwest of here, you have a compass. But he gave a speech connecting civil rights to Vietnam. And he said, a true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. Sending men home in the from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically damaged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. Do you doubt what he would say if he saw us today? A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of prisons, this way of settling differences is not just. You know, we measure our work with numbers, and the numbers say we succeed. But as we work to shift from punishment and retribution to redemption and reconciliation, I think the way to measure our success is probably to ask, can it be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love? I love you.